The Nest. Part 5. Battle Island Lockdown. Written by Shawn Carriere. Welcome to the National Film Board of Canada's Creative Writing Workshop. In this series, we will follow author Shawn Carriere as he goes through the process of writing the fifth installment of his dystopian science fiction survivor horror novels. Today's lesson: world building and consistent backstory. Setting. Naturally, we want our readers to be so familiar with where the story is taking place, it becomes second nature to imagine themselves right there, in the very heart of the action. So, how do we accomplish this? Let's start with the timeline, as well as our cataclysmic event. The cataclysmic event refers to some disastrous, devastating thing that happens sometime before the events of the story. It is quite often used as a means of explaining away why this fictional future world we're visiting is so bloody different from our world today. For example, scavenging for fuel and supplies is the only way to survive in the dystopian world of Mad Max. Why? First, because of economic collapse. Later, because there was a nuclear war. That's why. Being the ever-so-cheeky bastard that he is, author Shawn Carriere likes to keep his timelines vague and impossible to pin down for this series. The audience is left guessing as to when any of this takes place, thus forcing the reader's own imagination and sense of reason to do all the heavy lifting. I told you he's a cheeky bastard. Let's look at how he does it. The Nest. Part 5. Battle Island Lockdown. By Shawn Carriere. This story takes place 50 years after the first corporate wars. Now that we have our timeline established, as well as a cataclysmic event to legitimize the science fiction elements within our story, and help suspend our disbelief, we can finally begin to describe our setting. So, how do we go about delivering said description? In the prelude of this novel, Battle Island, the Mannix Core Hypermax prison compound that sits atop of Battle Island, the secret submarine base and ICA intelligence laboratory underneath Battle Island, as well as the deadly, unforgiving conditions of Lake Superior in November, are all delivered through the inner dialogue of Captain Buckley, Buck, Nishigami. He is the captain of the very last surviving lake trout class of freshwater submarines. Just what is a lake trout class of submarine? I hear some of you asking. Now's our chance to do some world building. 50 years earlier, as the first corporate wars raged across the continent like a wildfire, the lake trout was the most feared weapon on, in, or anywhere near the Great Lakes. Originally designed to lay GK-49 goodnight kiss smart minds, the lake trout also proved a stable platform, while surfaced of course, for launching Charlie Z suicide drones, Granger B-229 medium-range cruise missiles, the Horsefly 13 surface-to-air missile, and even the Sucker Punch mortar system with Gen 9 smart shells. With its cargo capacity of 6.9 tons, the lake trout was also ideal for inserting and extracting special forces teams, as well as delivering supplies to isolated troops operating around the Great Lakes. With a fleet just shy of 40 boats, the lake trout sank just over 200 enemy watercraft, down nearly half as many enemy aircraft, and denied ICA mercenary forces the ability to operate on, along, or even anywhere within 100 kilometers of these vital waterways, all without suffering a single loss. The lake trout is what they used to call a midget submarine, as it is only 3.4 meters tall, 3.2 meters wide, including the dive planes, with a length just over 13 meters. But don't let the lake trout size fool you. It can not only maneuver the rocky, shipwreck-strewn beds of the Great Lakes with ease, it is the quietest diesel-electric submarine ever built. Also, the lake trout's outer hull is made of a ceramic compound that increases structural rigidity while making the vessel completely invisible to wave-penetrating electromagnetic scans. Even if the enemy somehow got a lucky sensor lock on a lake trout, the little submarine's hydrocompression aquajet would allow it to make a quick and quiet getaway at a very impressive 29 knots, submerged. Also, the lake trout has an extendable snorkel system, allowing it to run its diesel engine while remaining at periscope depth. The Great Lakes were only one theater among many during the First Corporate Wars. Eventually, the Industrial Corporate Alliance overwhelmed the last of the globalist nationalist governments, and old world democracies, dictatorships, and even a couple straggler monarchies all ceased to exist. As the mercenaries the ICA had used to do their fighting for them became the new standing military, the entire fleet of lake trouts was ordered destroyed. The day before all the lake trouts were due for scuttling, one incredibly brave captain stole his boat back and escaped to an inlet near his hometown only he and his family knew about. That man was Captain Buckley Michigami's grandfather, Captain Charles Michigami. The Michigami lake trout remained perfectly hidden for nearly 15 years. But when economic hardship visited the family, Captain Charles Michigami took his oldest son Hank as his first mate, and the two began smuggling. The family business became a multi-generational family tradition as young Hank Michigami eventually became the captain, and his son Buckley became his first mate. As time passed, young Buckley became the new captain, with his own son, Mark, serving as his first mate. Buck had always done everything right. He'd followed the advice of his father and grandfather. He always moved with caution, and he never did business with anyone he didn't know. Yet, just 2 years earlier, Buck got caught in a massive sting operation conducted by the ICA's Office of Criminal Law. It was Buck's own best friend who'd set up a meeting between him and a man who wanted to move sensitive laboratory equipment to a tiny island near the north shore of Lake Superior. As Buck and a man calling himself only Hakim discussed the details of the job and agreed on a price, the restaurant they sat in became flooded with cops.
Freeze!
Hakim grinned at Captain Buck Michigami as he told him he was under arrest. To Buck, it felt like the world had just opened up and swallowed him whole. But Hakim wasn't a cop, and didn't work for the Office of Criminal Law. Later, as Buck sat in an interrogation room, Hakim explained that he worked for ICA intelligence. Hakim smiled as he went on to say he still wanted to hire Buck to move laboratory equipment, along with some science personnel to the island he'd mentioned earlier. Hush hush stuff, you know. Caught between a rock and a hard place, Buck made a deal with Hakim, and has worked for him exclusively ever since. For the past 2 years, Captain Buck Michigami and his son Mike have been doing weekly runs to Battle Island. Battle Island is home to a long-forgotten, corporate war-era submarine base once used for storing the dreaded Goodnight Kiss smart mines. But 10 years before the events of this story, Battle Island also became the location of Mannix Core, Compound R009. Known throughout the entire Mannix Core prison system as the last stop on a one-way road, the only hypermax status prison on the continent, Compound R009 is where the ICA Board of Directors sends people they wish to erase, but don't want to kill because death would be too merciful. Think of Compound R009 as an above-ground oubliette. If you're sent here, you're going to die here. Slowly. Very, very slowly. Here, 114 of the most dangerous lifers in the system are held. Inmates include convicted terrorists, young revolutionaries, drug lords, human traffickers, and other vice barons and merchants of misery, racketeers, extortionists, slicksters and gangsters, serial killers, family annihilators, and every other type of sicko. There are violent gang members and even a few shot callers. Anyone who has killed a guard at any other facility. Political prisoners. And anti-capitalist secessionists with too much influence. Also stored like cattle are ICA Army deserters and straight-up traitors. And they even have a captured Southern Bloc general. But most importantly for this story, Mannix Core Compound R009 is home to convicted Rivertown crime boss Johnny Popcorn Man Roma. But more on him later. Guards who work on this dreary rock earn 4 times as much as they'd earn at any other facility. And they can serve 4 or 6 month rotations. Before qualifying to work Compound R009, applicants must have at least 4 years experience at any maximum and or supermax compound within the Mannix Core system. They must be SORT certified, as well as hold an advanced field medic certification. They must not have a single corruption or abuse of power charge on their records. Lastly, all guards and staff must have basic seaman training. Logical qualification as they are on an island after all. None of the inmates, and none of the guards, are aware of the secret submarine base and laboratory underneath the eastern point of the island. And none of them know about the experiments being conducted down there. We open with Captain Buckley Michigami sitting in his lake trout submarine, submerged 6 meters deep, roughly 2 kilometers northeast of Battle Island. Captain Michigami watches through his digital periscope as supplies are being dropped off to Mannix Core Compound R009. Because of the shallow, rocky waters surrounding Battle Island, the main supply ship must remain at least 5.5 kilometers south of the island. And then the supplies must be brought over by unmanned, cargo Zodiacs. Despite the odds of anyone ever detecting the lake trout being somewhere between highly unlikely to impossible, Captain Michigami still waited patiently for the unmanned Zodiacs to complete their last runs, get back to the main supply ship, and get hoisted back on board. Captain Michigami watched the crew of the distant supply ship secure the Zodiacs to the deck, and noticed how the young sailors constantly paused and looked up at the sky. Tense, worried expressions cast on their faces. The captain said a silent prayer for the crew of the supply ship, wishing them safe passage back to port before the next storm was due to hit. At least for Captain Buck Michigami and his son and first mate, Mark, they were sitting in a submarine. As long as they stayed as far beneath the waterline as the waves could reach above, they were safe. The crews of surface boats didn't have that luxury. With the supply ships slowly disappearing over the horizon, the captain pointed his digital periscope at Battle Island. After a few seconds, the image came into focus, and Buck was looking at sandy beach along the north of the island. He could see two of the trustees securing their mini crane as another two pulled the dock back in. Further in, the compound's two flatbed pickup trucks were hauling their freshly delivered supplies up the short hill to the gates of the compound, a trustee behind the wheel of each pickup. Meanwhile, back down along Sandy Beach, the trustees finished their tasks and lined up like continental soldiers, ready for inspection. The two guards, one armed with an assault rifle, the other armed with a shotgun, looked the trustees over, smiled mockingly, and waved them up the hill toward the compound. Captain Mishigami watched the four lifers march up the hill, followed by the two guards. He then looked past the men, and up at the compound itself. The sight of the damned place always made Buck's skin crawl. With its thick, 5-story high concrete walls and multiple gun towers, Manic's core compound R009 resembled a medieval castle. But not in any fairy tale sense. After another minute had passed, the captain ordered his first mate to flood the tanks and bring them down to a depth of 24 meters. Mark acknowledged the order before carefully working the lever on his console, his eyes laser-focused on the depth gauge in front of him. Within seconds, they were at the desired depth, and Buck activated the aquajets, slowly accelerating them forward, and then maneuvering the tiny lake trout toward what seemed a sheer wall of rock. An underwater cliff face dead ahead. Both father and son were perfect examples of zen-like calm as they had made this trip well over 100 times by now. Just when it seemed they were going to crash, a cave appeared in the rock wall, right in front of them. The cave entrance was fairly circular with a diameter of just over 6 meters, more than enough space for Buck to safely pilot the lake trout through. With a steady hand on the controls, the captain drove his trusty lake trout into a cleverly hidden underwater tunnel. Darkness enveloped the tiny sub, and the gauges along the bridge's twin consoles became the only source of light. Captain Mishigami's sharp eyes constantly darted between the sonar's ultrasound pulse mapping data displayed on the flat-screen monitor in front of him, then over to his old-school analog instruments rigged to the central beam, then back again. The captain's surgeon-like hands worked the sub's controls, making tiny micro-adjustments so subtly, no one would have ever noticed any hand movement at all, even if they had been in a well-lit room. After several minutes of this very careful and delicate maneuvering, Captain Mishigami double-checked his navigational instruments, did some quick math in his head, and cut the engine. As the lake trout submarine came to a standstill, the captain rechecked his instruments, hit the button to pull the dive planes in, and only then did he order his first mate to blow the tanks. First mate, Mark Mishigami, acknowledged his father's order, pulled the right lever, and compressed air began pushing out all the water from the ballast tanks. The lake trout began to rise like a bubble. Instead of smacking itself against the rocky, jagged ceiling of the underwater cave, the sub just kept floating upward without incident. Then, the lake trout broke the surface, and Captain Mishigami and his first mate and son found themselves inside of a corporate war-era submarine base. This sub-base was inside of a massive cavern. A cavern carved out of the very living rock of Battle Island. In fact, the first time young Mark had seen it, He joked to his father that the whole place kinda looked like the Bat Cave, only spookier. The captain ordered his first mate to go inform their passenger they'd arrived. And young Mark responded with a sharp, "Aye, aye, sir," before slipping down to the pressure chamber just ahead of the bridge. The kid's a born sailor, Buck thought to himself. The captain then unlocked and popped the hatch above his head. As soon as he stood up to look out and pilot his boat to dock, Captain Mishigami could see Mistress Olga and the Ox standing near the controls for the base's bridge crane. Even though they were among his first 4 ever passengers to Battle Island, and he'd seen them week after week as he brought more equipment, more supplies, and eventually some more folks, he'd never learned their names. So, Captain Mishigami simply gave them the nicknames of Mistress Olga and Ox based on their muscular physiques and complete inability to ever smile. They looked like stereotypical roid ragers having a shitty day. As the lake trout nudged up against the dock, Mistress Olga was already securing the spring line. The muscle wench then moved to go tie the stern line, and Captain Mishigami flicked a row of switches in front of him before hitting a big red button. This revealed the little submarine's most marketable feature, a surprisingly spacious cargo hold, accessible via a space shuttle-inspired hatch. The hatch slowly opened like the doors of a cellar, and the captain could see down into the hold. He could see his first mate was standing with their passenger, Mr. Hackham. Strangely enough, this was Mr. Hackham's first ever visit to Battle Island. Much like an absentee landlord, he seemed to avoid this dreary place in favor of sunnier, more pleasant locations. Not once in nearly 2 years had he ever even checked in. Captain Mishigami reasoned to himself that something very, very important must have come up. Something very, very important indeed. Then, Mistress Olga completed securing the bow line, and shouted one word, "Secure." Ox repeated the word, and began working the controls for the bridge crane, positioning the hook and line above the lake trout's open cargo bay like a giant game of magic claw. The hook was lowered, and Mr. Hackham grabbed hold of it with both hands before being gently lifted up and dropped down onto the dock, right next to Mistress Olga. That's when 2 more semi-familiar faces appeared. From one of the cave-like corridors carved into the rocky walls, they emerged. One was a short, squatty, overweight woman who sported a septum ring to complement what had once been short, purple hair with hot pink streaks, but was now a dull, bluish frazzled mess with obvious graying. Next to her was a tall, fit, middle-aged man who stood with the perfect posture of a bank manager. A bank manager with an automatic handgun in a holster on his right hip, that is. This man had been among the first 4 passengers Buck had delivered here, and he never said who he was, or what he did. Like with Mistress Olga and Ox, the captain had given them nicknames. He called the woman Bertha, and he called the man Mr. Dietz, after the vice principal of his junior high school. Bertha and Mr. Dietz walked over to Mr. Hackham, and welcomed him with the warmth one usually reserves for when you invite the boss over for dinner. As Captain Mishigami watched his first mate attach the bridge crane's hook to a piece of cargo, the first of 6 sides of beef to be exact, he overheard Mr. Dietz call Mr. Hackham Colonel, and Mr. Hackham called Mr. Dietz Major in return. Before Buck could file that little nugget of information away, he glanced over the items he and his son were delivering. Nothing about the contract he'd taken with Mr. Oops. Make that Colonel Harkham made a whole lot of sense. But the items he brought over every week just seemed to get weirder and weirder. During the first dozen or so trips, Buck delivered lab equipment, tools, and the general supplies one could expect. Things like diesel for the base's generator, medical supplies, and food. Over the last few months, that last part, food, seemed more than a little odd. On this trip alone, Buck and his son were delivering 6 sides of beef, frozen thank God. Along with these dead heifers, were just as many frozen pig corpses, and over 500 frozen chickens. Then, there were 4 oil drums filled with a mix of grain and corn. This has been the manifest over the last 3 trips alone. Just what the hell were they feeding down here? There were only 3 other people within this secret submarine base, and there was no way they could eat that much in a week. Captain Mishigami watched Mistress Olga detach the hook and let the first side of beef fall onto an electric cart, and then noticed Major Dietz and Bertha leading Colonel Harkham down one of the cave-like corridors. The 2 of them looked like excited children, eager to show off something for Daddy to put up on the refrigerator. After watching Colonel Harkham disappear down the long, dark corridor, led like a puppy by his 2 lackey underlings, Captain Mishigami shouted down to his son that he was going to make camp. That was their code word for preparing to spend the night. When Mr. Harkham said he'd be riding along on the next supply run to Battle Island and check how things were progressing, Buck knew he and his first mate wouldn't get to leave until the next day. The submarine base had been built to house dozens of personnel, and the accommodations were still very much up to snuff. Down the same hallway the Colonel had disappeared into were a series of smaller caves, carved into the rock to each side of the hall, and each one serving as a separate room. One cave was the mess hall, another cave was the head, and then another cave was the gym. That last one had to be Mistress Olga and Ox's favorite, Captain Mishigami thought to himself. And another dozen carved-out caves further down the hall served as sleeping quarters. Captain Mishigami, nor his first mate, had any intention of sleeping in the caves. To trust is good, but not to trust is better. That was the Mishigami family motto. Buck and his son, Mark, would sleep on the lake trout, in shifts, and with 2 loaded shotguns within easy reach, of course. But for now, Captain Mishigami was going to take advantage of at least one of the base's accommodations. He was going to the mess cave and get himself some fresh coffee. Captain Mishigami climbed out of his trusty little submarine, hopped down onto the dock, nodded politely to Mistress Olga, and then made his way toward the hall. About 10 meters down the long hallway, and to his left, the captain found the mess cave, and went straight to the coffee machine. Buck poured himself a hot cup of life juice, took a seat at one of the 4 tables, and sipped carefully at his warm beverage, savoring the flavor, as well as the tiny bit of comfort it brought him. After taking another sip of Java, Captain Mishigami wondered if his grandpa, the original captain of the lake trout, had ever loaded up on Goodnight Kiss smart mines at this very submarine base back during the war. The captain smiled at the thought, and took another sip. And that's when he looked up from his cup, and at the long, dark, shadowy corridor just outside of the mess cave. The mess cave, and the precious coffee machine inside, were the farthest the Carriere smuggler would ever dare venture into the sub-base. And Buck had no idea just how far the hallway stretched. For all he knew, the damn thing could reach as far as several hundred meters, right into the heart of the island. The thought of it made the captain shiver. So, he got up and refilled his cup. Meanwhile, 127 meters down along the long, dark, shadowy corridor to be exact, Bertha and Major Dietz had just unlocked a massive blast door, and were now waiting for it to open. The blast door had barely opened wide enough when Bertha and Major Dietz led Colonel Hackham inside. The three of them stepped through, and the colonel found himself in another massive cavern, this one even bigger than the submarine pen. But what made this cavern so special were the thousands of corporate war-era Goodnight Kiss mines still stored inside. Rows upon rows of stealth sea mines equipped with directional concussive generators, sensors that can differentiate between a friendly ship, a civilian ship, or an enemy ship, and the ability to send out decoy signals in order to draw enemy vessels closer. The Goodnight Kiss was every sailor's worst nightmare. Major Dietz, sensing the colonel's unease, explained that as soon as he and his two engineers had arrived at the island, he had them defuse every last one of the mines that had been left behind after the war. It had taken them nearly 3 weeks, he added, but the fuses for every last mine had been carefully removed, then dropped into the water at the sub-pen. Bertha then pulled at the colonel's coat sleeve, anxiously leading him toward another blast door at the opposite end of the massive, hangar-like space. This blast door was unlocked, and it came open immediately. Bertha and Major Dietz then led the colonel into another section, but this one had no bombs in it. In here was something far more frightening than any bomb. This cavern had been kitted out into a state-of-the-art biolab. Bertha smiled at Colonel Hackham and said, "Welcome to Operation Universe 26. Despite funding the project, recruiting the personnel, purchasing every piece of equipment, and having chosen the location, Colonel Hackham couldn't help but be impressed with what the Major and his team had accomplished in just over 27 months. The lab was built inside a tunnel 4.8 meters in diameter, and the three were standing in the first of the 4 chambers that made up the lab, the main control and data collation chamber. This was essentially an office bullpen with multiple workstations topped with wafer-thin data pads, keyboards, flat-screen computer monitors, chewed-up pens, and paper notepads. Of course, the colonel just had to take a moment and glance over the dozen or so flat-screen monitors, as they were all brimming with data. Valuable data. Meanwhile, Bertha punched a 4-digit code into a panel along the rear wall, and an instant later, a sliding metal door opened, allowing them access into chamber number 2 of the 4. This was the chemistry lab and vivisection theater. The colonel stepped inside, and he nearly gasped. This was the most, well, stereotypical, cliched, mad scientist-looking laboratory the colonel could have ever imagined. Along one wall was the main workstation, a bench topped with only the best bioanalysis widgets, doodahs, whatchamacallits, and thingamajigs money could buy. Against the opposite wall was what looked like a massive incubator on casters. This was the vivisection chamber. At the moment, one of the scientists was working the chamber's control console, using the robotic arms inside to slowly cut open a creature that had already been secured onto its back by spikes through its 4 claw-like paws. Colonel Hackham stepped closer, and peeked inside the odd-looking box on wheels. Alive and conscious, a mutated, oversized rat was slowly getting its chest and belly sliced open by a laser scalpel. The entire time, the ugly beast didn't yelp out in pain, growl with agony, or even hiss. Instead, the rat just stared silently through the thick plexiglass of the chamber, and gnawed its big, jagged teeth at the very scientist working the robotic arms. The bloody thing knew exactly who was torturing it to death, and was memorizing the torturer's face. Before the colonel could ask the scientist if the rat felt pain, he heard another steel door slide open. It was time to visit the third chamber of the four. Bertha and Major Dietz were standing to each side of this now open door. They both gestured like the prize models on a game show. And Colonel Hacken took a deep breath, steadying himself for what he was about to be shown next. The colonel stepped through the door, and finally came face to face with the whole reason he'd funded this project in the first place. In the middle of the room was a 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter plexiglass cube. The rat the colonel had just watched being vivisized in the other room was big, much bigger than any rat had the right to be. But this ugly, monstrous thing inside of this transparent cage was massive by comparison. Pacing back and forth was a rat the size of a greyhound dog. This had to be it, the colonel thought to himself. This had to be the king rat. It took us several dozen reproduction cycles before we were able to get an example of the king rat, Bertha said with pride. Hang on. How many beta rats have been produced so far? Colonel Hacken asked. We lost count after the first 1400, sir, answered the major. Bertha then gestured to the back of the room, and there it was. A thick plexiglass wall separating them from the fourth chamber of the four. On the other side of that transparent wall was Universe 26. This was the rats' breeding ground. A spaciously carved out cavern, more than big enough to park a couple dozen transport trucks in. The thick plexiglass had an airlock-like doorway built into it, as well as a massive sliding feed port, 2.5 times the size of a coffin. The feed box was transparent as well, and the colonel could see what was inside of it. A side of beef, 2 pigs, over 100 chickens, and several buckets worth of corn and grain. Standing by the feed port were the last 2 scientists on the project. The 2 stood at attention, smiling warmly at their benefactor. You're just in time to see the beta rats get fed, Bertha announced. Would you care to do the honors, Colonel? Asked Major Dietz. The 2 last scientists politely stepped aside as the colonel, the major, and Bertha all stepped up to the feed port's controls. Colonel Hacken paused, looked into Universe 26, but saw only shadows. Hey, I don't see any rats, the colonel said. Just hit the green button, sir, and you'll see all the rats you could ever want, Bertha answered back gleefully. Curious, the colonel hit the green button, and the transparent feed box was lifted into place by a hydraulic system. Then, once the box was in position, the port slid open, and the dead animals, grain, and corn all poured and tumbled into the dark cave, just on the other side of the thick plexiglass. Like something out of a nightmare, thousands of rats, each the size of a full-grown raccoon, came flooding out from the shadows, and swarmed over the food. It all happened so quickly, So suddenly, the Colonel caught himself taking a step back. Despite the thick plexiglass wall between him and these horrifying creatures, the Colonel had never seen anything like it. These bloody things were like land piranha, blanketing and devouring their prey in seconds. But then, he saw something even more disturbing. The rats at the rear of the pack, the ones who were a few seconds late to the party, and weren't able to get anywhere near the food in time, began biting into the mass of countless rodents already feasting, and ripping huge chunks of flesh out of their fellow rats. As if reading the Colonel's mind, the Major said, "We feed them 4 times per day, sir. Yet they still eat each other." Then, as soon as it all started, it ended. The rats all disappeared back into the shadows. The Colonel had expected to see some bones left over, but the floor just on the other side of the plexiglass had been licked clean. Not a trace of the food was left. Colonel Hackham smiled. They'd done it. They'd managed to snatch a few Prega rats out of the C-zone, and just let them reproduce until they finally made an alpha. Until they made him a king rat. Speaking of, Colonel Hackham wanted to look over his prize again. He turned away from the plexiglass wall, and walked back over to the plexiglass cube. Inside the transparent cage, the king rat was pacing back and forth excitedly, almost like it sensed something. Like a loyal pet whose owner has just come home. Then, the big rodent stopped moving, and just turned its head to stare back out at the Colonel. Just like the rat in the other room that stared silently at the scientist working the very machinery cutting it open. The king rat silently stared at the Colonel. Right into his beady little eyes. Like he'd been challenged, Colonel Hackham stared back even harder, wondering to himself who would blink first in this interspecies staring contest. The king rat did not blink. Instead, the big rodent's sharp, red eyes were boring twin cigarette burns right into the Colonel's soul. As smart as the Colonel believed himself to be, he was now like a cat in a string. He was locked into a very deep, almost hypnotic eye contact with the beast. He couldn't help but feel like the beast was reading him. And he certainly couldn't look away, even if he wanted to. That's when it happened. The king rat's mouth twisted into what the Colonel could only describe as a smirk. A grin even. The fucking thing was grinning at the Colonel. Colonel Hackham was very amused by all of this, and he grinned back mockingly at the captive king rat. Strange. First time it's ever done this, commented Major Deeds. The Colonel was about to quit back with some platitude, something like, first time for everything, but he never got the chance. Without warning, the king rat's eyes went wide, and its whole body stiffened. Then, the beast keeled over. The damn thing looked like it had just suffered a fatal heart attack. At the same time, one of the 2 other scientists had just put on an oversuit made of carbon fiber chainmail, and was stepping through the airlock booth, and into the Universe 26 habitat. The young scientist wasn't the least bit worried as his suit's chainmail was supposed to make it bite-proof. Also, the exterior was electrified. In case the rats came too close, he was armed with a small, fire extinguisher-sized canister of liquid nitrogen, and, as if that wasn't enough, in a custom holster across the suit's belly was a dart gun. A 6-shooter design loaded with a heavy-duty knockout concoction. Each squeeze of the trigger would spit out a dart loaded with a higher dose than the last. The young scientist slipped on a pair of night vision goggles, and began looking around for some more vivisection subjects. As he stepped into the massive, shadowy cave, The young scientist noticed every rat he looked at was laying dead. Not a single one of the monstrous little demons was moving. Not one of them so much as twitched, or even seemed to suck air. Dead as doornails, the lot of them. This isn't possible, he thought to himself. Despite his better judgment, the young scientist stepped further into the cavern than protocol would normally have allowed. Meanwhile, back in the second of the lab's 4 main sections, the scientist working the vivisection machine was busy observing the still beating heart of the rat inside. By now, the scientist had dissected and documented over 100 of the mutants, and he knew just how tough and resilient they can be. For example, he knew it would be at least 3 hours before the beast laying within the machine before him would finally succumb and die. But then, to the scientist's surprise, the rat stopped staring at him and just expired right there. The beast couldn't be faking it. Its heart was clearly visible as the beats slowed and eventually ceased. What the hell? This can't be right, the scientist thought as confusion and worry washed over him like a bucket of ice-cold water. Curiosity overcame caution, and the scientist unlocked the vivisection chamber's top hatch before opening it like the hood of a car that's broken down by the side of the road. Back in Section 3 of the lab's 4 main sections, panic seemed to grip both Bertha and Major Dietz. The two were working electronic panels built into the sides of the plexiglass cube. Each panel had a digital readout showing the king rat's vital functions. Right now, the readouts were showing flat lines across the board. What the hell is going on? Colonel Hackham demanded to know. Insufficient data, Colonel, the Major answered as he kept working one of the panels, hoping against hope the readouts were a glitch. A malfunction of the sensors built into the cage perhaps. Some kind of mistake. A false positive. Anything. Anything but the Colonel's investment dropping dead right in front of him. Bertha had just sprinted to a nearby cabinet to fetch an emergency kit. She soon returned carrying a syringe and a defibrillator. "Don't just stand there, you idiot," she barked at the Major. "Open the fucking cage already." As all this was going on, just over 20 meters inside of Universe 26, 10 meters deeper into the rodent's enclosed environment than anyone was ever supposed to venture, the young scientist spotted the first living rat he'd seen in minutes. There it was. The thing was sitting another dozen or so meters into the dark cavern. It simply stared at the young scientist, appearing as curious about him as he was about it. The creature was just out of range for a clean shot with the dart gun. So, foolishly, the young scientist stepped even further into the rat's habitat. Meanwhile, back in Section 2 of the lab's 4 main sections, the scientist had set up a stepladder, climbed it, and was reaching a hand inside of the vivisection chamber. He was going to attempt a basic heart massage technique, and see if that wouldn't bring the already sliced open rodent back to life. Then, just when his fingers were within a few centimeters of the seemingly dead creature, back inside of the Universe 26 cavern, the young scientist had gotten close enough for a clean shot, and was aiming his dart gun at the quiet rat sitting near the back of the habitat. The creature was still just looking at him. The young scientist was just about to squeeze the trigger and send the little monster off to dreamland, when he heard movement behind him. He spun on his heel, and saw the hundreds of dead rats he'd walked past were now very much alive. The ugly things were standing between the young scientists and the only exit. The other young scientist, the one who was watching from the other side of the plexiglass wall, shrieked in horror as they watched their colleague get swarmed over by hundreds of oversized rats in less than a second.
Oh no!
The young scientist's shrieks were enough to distract Bertha as she knelt over the king rat's lifeless body. A moment earlier, the Major had opened the door to the cubed plexiglass cage for her, and she was now about to use the defibrillator to jumpstart the creature's heart. When Bertha looked up to see what the young scientist was making so much noise over, the king rat's eyes sprung open, and the demon lunged right at her. Bertha never stood a chance. Back up in the nest cave, Captain Buckley Michigami down his fourth, and what he promised himself, his final cup of coffee for the day. He stretched his sore, cramped legs, and prepared to walk back out into the cold, damp sub-pen, and then climb back into his lake trout. That's when he heard what sounded like distant gunshots. Whoever was shooting, they seemed to be getting closer. The captain peeked outside the mess cave, and down the long, shadowy corridor. Over 50 meters down along the hallway, Buck could see Major Deeds running toward him. The Major had unholstered his handgun, and he was firing it behind him blindly as he ran. The magazine in the Major's gun ran dry, and he tossed it away. As he watched the Major running toward him, Buck knew he should be hightailing it right along with him. But the smuggler's curiosity was just too strong, so he stood in place, waiting to see what the Major was running from. When Major Dietz was only a dozen meters away, Buck saw it. He couldn't believe what he saw. But he saw it. It was a mass of thousands of raccoon-sized rats, all rushing up the hallway. And they were moving fast. Very, very fast. Buck almost smacked into Major Dietz as the two of them sprinted toward the sub-pen. But it was too late. The two men were completely swarmed over by rats who didn't hesitate to bite into them, ripping fist-sized chunks of flesh from their bodies faster than either man's pain receptors could keep up. First Mate Mark, Mistress Olga, and the Ox were out in the sub-pen when they heard the Major and Captain Michigami screaming. Then, the rats flooded out into the pen. Feeding time was far from over, as these rodents had only just begun to feast. And that was just the prelude. The plot still hasn't been established, and we haven't even been introduced to any of our main characters yet. I'm afraid that's going to have to wait until the next episode. I hope you'll tune in, because we're going to build a character Bible, including each character's own backstory and motivation. Then, we'll set the groundwork for the main plot. So, until the next creative writing workshop, find a pen, a pencil, and something to write on. And just start writing already.